Chapter 9. It's not fair! Grumpy's voice echoed through the cottage. Outside, the sun was shining and birds chirped cheerfully, but Grumpy was anything but cheery. They had agreed to let Snow White stay the night, but now it was day, and she was still there, sleeping upstairs while the seven milled about the kitchen. He went on, ignoring the looks of the others, who clearly didn't mind Snow White's presence. It's the morning and she's still here. They'll come looking for her, and when they find her... Grumpy drew a finger across his throat. His eyes landed on Dopey, who was staring at him in horror. What do you have to say about that? Nothing? That's what. They heard Snow White moving about the room upstairs. Her soft voice drifted down the stairway as she mumbled something to herself. Happy listened for a moment, and then turned to his friend. Now, Grumpy, he said, you know Dopey won't talk. It was true. Dopey hadn't spoken in a long time, not since they had known him, at least. Still, it wasn't kind to pick on him. Usually Grumpy managed to keep his anger in check toward him, but that day he was obviously grumpier than usual. Happy stepped forward, hoping to defuse the situation and stop a fight before it started. He knew what happened once they got going. It was one of the disadvantages of living and working together. They could be a bit hard on one another. Normally, he might have let it run its course, but that day was different. They had company, and at that moment, said company was watching the seven of them with interest. Guys, he said, holding up his hands, let's all just try to be friends. Grumpy, his knickers all in a twist, grabbed a loaf of bread. He threw the bread toward Sneezy. At the last moment, Sneezy ducked, and the bread smacked into Sleepy's face. Yawning but clearly annoyed, Sleepy grabbed an egg and hurled it at Grumpy. In answer, a piece of food was thrown back at him. Sighing, he picked up a hunk of cheese and threw it back. Soon the others, save Dopey and Doc, were in the midst of a full-blown food fight. Food of all shapes and sizes flew back and forth across the kitchen, landing on everyone and surfaces and quickly making the place even messier than it had been before. Over the ruckus, Grumpy set his eyes on Happy and tackled him. The two rolled under the kitchen table, crushing bits of food left and right as they fought. On top of the table, Sneezy and Bashful fenced with baguettes. In the meantime, Dopey chased a firefly around the room with Doc, while Doc, the calm in the midst of chaos, sat trying to eat his soup. With a swish and a thrust of his baguette, Sneezy parried and advanced, unfortunately stepping on the foot of Sleepy, who awoke with a yell. Snow White, who was still upstairs, paused as the sounds of the commotion continued to escalate. Bless you, buddy. As the others succumbed to a brawl, Dopey slipped out through the front door, his head hung low. Snow White had never seen anything like the food fight in the kitchen. As an only child, she had never been in a squabble with a sibling, nor had she ever said mean words in a heated moment. Watching the seven of them snap back and forth at each other, she didn't know what to do. It didn't seem right to step in, but she didn't want to sit idly by as they destroyed the cottage and hurt each other. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Dopey untangle himself from the pile and head out the door. Caught up in the fight, the others didn't notice. Moving past the group, Snow White followed Dopey outside. She found Dopey sitting on the front steps with a sad expression on his face. Are you all right? She asked softly. In answer, his head drooped farther, and he kicked at a leaf. Makes you want to run and hide, Snow White said softly. She had heard a bit of the earlier part of the conversation and figured it wasn't the first time Grumpy had picked on Dopey. Dopey nodded. When his eyes rose to meet hers, their expressive depths showed her how helpless he felt. She pursed her lips and thought for a moment. Dopey was an agreeable guy, and she didn't like to see him upset. What would her father have said to her if someone had picked on her? Snow White leaned closer. Snow White smiled. Even though she could speak, she hadn't talked to anyone, really talked to anyone, in a long time. Dopey looked like he was the youngest of the 7. At some point, he had realized it was easier to just be quiet than to try to be heard. Like her? It made her sad for a moment to realize all they might have missed out on. But then she remembered the locket. Be brave, be true. She could help Dopey. And maybe, along the way, she would help herself too. Are you afraid to speak? She asked. Dopey looked down again. Well, she said, and took a deep breath. Maybe we could start with something small. When I was a little girl, my mother taught me how to whistle. She paused as she heard something crash to the ground inside the cottage. She went on. So even when I'm afraid to speak, I whistle. Because when you whistle, it's your heart speaking. Slowly, she reached out and put her palm over Dopey's heart. His eyes widened. Tilting her head, she listened as the others yelled back and forth at one another. Oblivious that both she and Dopey were no longer inside, speaking as much to them as to Dopey, she added, and that voice, the one that's hidden in your heart, can be heard. The other 6 of them had no problem yelling at one another, but were any of them truly speaking? She was quite certain none of them were being listened to. Maybe this would help. Pursing her lips again, she blew a happy little tune. She nodded at Dopey. See? Now you try. Scrunching his eyes in concentration, he put his lips together and blew. Nothing but air came out. Try it again, Snow White said gently. Once again he tried. And once again, the only sound that came out of his mouth was the hiss of air. Snow White watched and thought. A vague memory of standing by the well with her mother floated through her mind. Snow White had been so young, and she had wanted desperately to show her mother she could whistle. She had tried and tried, harder and harder. That was it. She knew what was wrong, just enough to make a candle flicker. Not go out, she told him. Nodding, Dopey took another breath, and then, very gently, he began to blow. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder. Soon, a clear whistle echoed through the clearing. You did it, Snow White said, clapping her hands happily. I knew you could. Dopey stared at her, his cheeks red and his eyes bright. He didn't have to say a word. Snow White knew exactly what he was thinking. He had made a sound. It was the small step Snow White had mentioned, and the effect was huge. Turning to the cottage, Snow White inhaled and pushed back her shoulders. Come on, she said, grabbing Dopey's hand and striding toward the door. She had helped Dopey. Now it was time to help the others before they destroyed themselves and their home.